Hello guys, welcome back to Life Technologies channel and thank you for watching. So in our previous videos, that is part 1 and part 2, we've covered basic SIS configuration for our network and also how to do cost planning and configuration on our IPRAN network. So once you've set up the network, the main objective is to have end-to-end connectivity. You need to be able to communicate from the access to the aggregation ring. But remember, we have segmented our network into different SIS process. So how do we achieve the connectivity, the end-to-end connectivity from the access site to the aggregation node? Because we have the access site which is connecting to the BTS or the E not B, and then we have the aggregation side that is now connecting to the controllers, for example, the RNC, the BSC. So you need to have a way in which you can ensure there is end-to-end connectivity. And now that we've segmented our network into different SIS, definitely the access process doesn't know how to reach the aggregation, and the aggregation also doesn't know how to reach the access. So if we log into the routers, we haven't done any route import on this aggregation. Route import is normally done on the aggregation nodes, especially the ASGs that are aggregating different access rings. So if we just check our current configuration ISIS, you can see we don't have any route import configured on these between these two ISIS. No ISIS 100 is imported to ISIS 20, and similarly ISIS 20 is not imported to ISIS 100. So if we check, for example, on this router, this CSG2, if I display IP routing table, you realize that we don't have any route from ISIS 100. We don't even have the loopbacks of SG02 and SG01. We are not able to reach those loopbacks because we don't have the routes. If we check on all the other routers, if I do display IP routing table, similarly, I don't have any route or any prefix coming from the aggregation process. But of course, if you check on the aggregation node, if I display IP routing table, I have the routes both to the aggregation and to the access, because remember on this node we have two ISIS process, and it's telling us that we've learned these routes via ISIS. As you can see, we have the route, we have the cost that is configured, and yeah, we have all the routes both from access and aggregation. That's why this is the best point of applying our route import, where we have the access and aggregation nodes. So if I were to ping, remember at the end of the day, we have to be able to reach the loopback 0 of these SGs, because at the end of the day, we'll be configuring BGP for the service level route exchange. So you realize we don't have a route to the aggregation nodes, the loopbacks of the aggregation nodes. So that's why once you've segmented your network into different SIS process, you need to go ahead and do route import. You need to import the access SIS process into the aggregation process, and you also need to do a route import from the aggregation process. You import it to the access. Now you will have an end-to-end connectivity between different rings and aggregation. But you don't just import the routes directly. If you import it, as in you don't import everything. Never import everything just because sometimes you have so many routes, you have very huge network, and you can't import everything to the access rings. The access ring should only import the route that it requires. In this case, we only need to import, for example, the loopbacks of SGs to the access ring. So we import the loopbacks of SG01 and SG02 to access ring 1, and we do the same. We import the loopbacks of SG03 and SG04 to access string 2. So how do you do the route import? The implementation steps are very clear. The first step is you need to determine which routes you want to be exchanged between the access and aggregation. Which specific prefixes do you want to exchange between the processes? Remember, we are not importing everything between the access processes. Once you've determined which prefixes you want to exchange between the processes, the next step is you configure IP prefixes. The IP prefixes will be used to match the routes that we want to allow the processes to exchange between themselves, and then we configure a route policy. This route policy will now match the routes based on IP prefix, and once we've configured the route policy, we import now the ISIS processes into each other using the route policy. So these are the steps that you must follow when you are doing route importation. So first, you need to determine which routes you want to be exchanged between access and aggregation processes. Then you configure IP prefixes to match those prefixes that you want to allow. Then you configure route policies. Don't just import them directly. Once you've configured the route policy, now you can use this route policy to be able to import the routes between different processes. So these are the configurations. I've mentioned we are only doing route import on the aggregation nodes because those are the points where we are having two processes, the aggregation process and the access process. So as you can see, for example, on SG1, what we are doing is we are creating one IP prefix, and it's always good practice to give it a name that can tell what it's doing. So for example, this one I've named it, import aggregation loopback. So this IP prefix just imports the loopback 0 of SG01. And we've matched the loopback 0 of SG01 with 4.4.4. The mask is 32. Then we have a second IP prefix, and this second IP prefix, the function is to import access to aggregation. Remember, we need to import both the loopbacks and also the point-to-point. So if you can see in our network, we are using /31. So in our IP prefix, we are doing permit all IPs, and then we are saying that they should be /30, mask of 30. So it's greater equal to 30, which means it's 30, 31, and 32. That is the less equal 32. So we have two prefixes, the one matching the loopbacks of the aggregation node and the one that will be used to import the access routes to the aggregation ISIS process. So once we've configured the IP prefix, we are now moving to step 2, where we configure the route policies. As you can see, we have two route policies. The first route policy is for import access to aggregation, and we are merging that IP prefix import access to aggregation. Then the second one is import aggregation loopbacks, and we use a similar. So the same way we've named our IP prefix is the same way we are naming our route policies. This is just a best practice, and it will even help someone who is troubleshooting any issue in the network. So once we've done this, we now go ahead and do it. We now import ISIS routes between these processes, and we are using the route policies. So I have ISIS 100, I'm importing ISIS 20, route policy import access to aggregation. And then in ISIS 20, I'm importing direct route. Remember, we are only importing the loopback 0 of this router. But sometimes you may have other route that you need to import. Also, you need to create another route policy, and then you can merge those prefix that you want to be able to be reachable from the access processes, from the access routers, that is. So on SG2, we do the same. The only change is we are now merging the loopback 0 of SG2. Similarly to SG3, we merge the loopback of SG3, and on 4 we merge the loopback of SG4. So once we've prepared our script, we can now go and configure on the routers. So I will start by creating the IP prefix on SG1 for our demonstration. So I have the IP prefixes. On SG1, I have already configured the IP prefix. That's why they are reporting that they already created. Then for our route policies, I configure the route policies. So if I do display IP prefix, you can see we have two IP prefixes, one for import aggregation to loopbacks and one to import access to aggregation. Then I can also display route policy. And you can see we have import access to aggregation route policy, which is using this IP prefix, and we also have import aggregation loopbacks that is using these IP prefixes. So once we have these route policies in place, we now go ahead and import the routes between the two processes. So I will now configure these to import the route policy between the aggregation and access, and also access to aggregation. So yeah, now we have routes imported. If I go back to CSG2, if I do display IP prefix again, route policy, you can see that our route policy already has matched counts too. And if I log into CSG02, remember this was the route table before we did any route import. We didn't have any prefixes from the aggregation. So now if I do display IP routing table again, let me check this one. So in ISIS new, imported the route, and then import route ISIS route policy access. Okay, we've imported it. Then this one we did import route direct cost 1000. We check again the route policies down here. We have 4.4.4 permit, and this. Okay, let me go back to CSG01, display IP routing table. It's CSG02 or CSG01. So when I display the IP routing table on CSG01, you can see that we now have the loopbacks of this router is now advertised to this node. It's now reachable from this node. So I can do ping 4.4.4.4, it will be reachable. I check again CSG2, display IP routing table. We have the routes. We have 4.4.4, and you can see the cost is calculated as 1020. If you check up here, we didn't have those routes coming, but now they are coming from the aggregation process. Display IP routing table again. We have the routes. I can ping 4.4.4. Yes, we are able to ping 4.4.4. So even on the aggregation, this core node, if I display IP routing table, I now expect to be learning the loopbacks of the CSGs in access ring in access ring 1. As you can see, we have 1515, we have 1414. We are now able to learn them via the route import that we have done on this aggregation node. So we can go ahead and do the configuration on SG02, SG03, SG04, and then now routes will be propagated and there will be connectivity from the access ring to the aggregation. But if you don't do route import between these processes, then you will have disconnectivity between the nodes. You won't be able to reach the aggregation from the access. So it's always good practice to do the route import. And when you are doing the route import, always remember to use route policies and only import what is required. Don't import everything. Another thing to mention is it's not a best practice to import two access processes into each other. Like, for example, if we had a connection between access ring 1 and access ring 2, never import access ring 1 to access ring 2 unless you have the necessary route policy that will help you to control the route import between these two processes. So just to summarize, remember that the first step you need to do is to determine which routes you want to be exchanged between the access and aggregation processes. Then you need to configure the IP prefixes to match the route that you want to be exchanged. The third step will be to configure route policies on the router. Don't just import the processes, use route policies to control how route exchange will happen between the processes. And once you've done the route import, once you've done the policy configuration, you can now import the routes using the route policies between the access and aggregation. So this is how you do the route importation. I hope the video has been helpful, and thank you for watching, and please subscribe to our channel for more videos. Thank you.